A mad dash to be the highest, followed by a slow slide down to now the lowest. It's been a roller coaster decade for minimum wage policy in Alberta. So where do we go from here? That's next on the Line Alberta Podcast. Hey folks, thanks for joining us here on the Line Alberta Podcast. My name is Rob Breakenridge. This week, a closer look at minimum wage policy in Alberta, how Alberta briefly became the province with the highest minimum wage in the country, how we now ended up with the lowest minimum wage in the country, and what to do next. A brief history here. Alberta's minimum wage policy was previously linked to an annually adjusted formula that factored in changes to overall wages and inflation. The wage was at just over $10 an hour when the NDP took power in 2015. Now, this was around the time of a burgeoning and broader campaign calling for a $15 an hour minimum wage. And this is where the Notley NDP planted their flag. By 2018, the minimum wage was indeed $15 an hour. And now here in 2025, the minimum wage is still $15 an hour. Now, the UCP has argued that the Notley NDP went too far too fast on minimum wage. There was a need to allow the economy to catch up. But now, as of October 1st, every other province has surpassed Alberta. Saskatchewan was the last at $15 an hour, but as of Wednesday, they're now at $15.35. So where does that leave Alberta? Last week, at a press conference live streamed on their social media channels, current NDP leader Naheed Nenshi called for an increase in the minimum wage, but notably declined to give a specific number when pressed by a reporter.
You know, the problem here is that the UCP's done nothing for 7 years. Had they continued with Rachel Notley's plan and indexed it to inflation, we wouldn't be in this situation now. So the challenge here is, if you do it all at once, that's very disconcerting for small businesses. It's very dislocating. And so what we'd have to do is figure out a schedule in consultation with low-wage earners and in consultation with employers to figure out how to get there. But ultimately, this is the job of the UCP government, and we'd love to see what proposals they come up with. Right now, their proposal is nothing. And if they simply adjust it to inflation this year, then that won't nearly be enough to make a difference for people. So we've got to figure out that right phase-in schedule.
And Sean, do you have a follow-up?
Sorry, I didn't hear a number. Can you please give us some numbers?
No, because ultimately this has to be done in consultation, and this is government's job.
Minimum wage is a tricky thing, of course. There's no cost to government in increasing the wage, and it's not exactly a targeted anti-poverty tool. According to the Alberta government, just over 5% of the workforce earns minimum wage. When you factor in students, not to mention those who have second jobs or are secondary earners in their household, what are you left with? And this also leaves out those workers who earn just above minimum wage. Plus, there is the concern that minimum wage increases can lead to fewer hours or reduced job opportunities for those minimum wage jobs. In 2019, the Alberta government struck an expert panel to study minimum wage. That report was submitted just as the pandemic hit, so we didn't get to see the report until 3 years later. But that report did find that many minimum wage earners did benefit from the higher wage, but it also found the rapid push to $15 an hour caused job losses, and the young people were disproportionately affected. The chair of that panel was University of Alberta economist Joseph Marchand, a leading expert on minimum wage policy. I caught up with Professor Marchand to talk about Alberta's experience, where we are now, and where we go from here. Here's that conversation. All right, well, joining us now on the Line Alberta for some further perspective on Alberta's minimum wage policy debate and where we go from here. Very pleased to be joined by Joseph Marchand. He's professor of economics at the University of Alberta, founding director of the Alberta Centre for Labour Market Research, and was chair of the 2019 expert panel in Alberta on minimum wage. Joseph, great to have you with us here.
Thanks for having me.
It's interesting, the roller coaster Alberta has been on over the last decade or so, but I mean, prior to that, if we go back a little bit further, were we kind of around average, or where were we at before this roller coaster?
Yeah, it's very interesting comparing Canada to the U.S. in that it seems that in Canada, provinces and territories tend to have a first mover when it comes to the minimum wage. So they set their minimum wage above everyone else. And then all the other provinces and territories eventually get to that first mover. Whereas in the US, it's more bifurcated, where there's a whole bunch of states at the federal floor that aren't trying to set their minimum wages above the federal floor. They're not even thinking about it. And then a bunch that have got their minimum wages some twice the federal floor in the US. So yeah, it's quite interesting that in Canada it works that way, and it's worked that way at least twice within the last 15 years or so. So if we go back to like 2010, there was kind of this race to $10.
Right.
So right around the early kind of 2010s, there was this race to $10. All the provinces and territories got there. For Alberta, that's where we found ourselves in 2015. We were at 10.20, right? So we were still kind of in that part of the distribution where everybody was bunched up at. And then Alberta makes this move to $15 from 2015 to 2018. Right. And we were the first mover. And now in 2025, everyone's pretty much joined us or surpassed us. And it looks like there might even be a new race to $20, right?
Oh, wow. But I guess, as you mentioned, the U.S., like Canada, this is strictly the province's purview, right? I mean, there is a federal wage that affects, I guess, federally regulated industries, but otherwise, like, there's no federal floor, right? Ottawa doesn't really have any say with what the provinces do.
That's correct. So yeah, in the U.S., there's a federal floor. It applies to all states that don't have their own minimum wages. Here, it's all provincial and territorial, with the exception of federal regulated industries. But even the minimum wage for federally regulated industries didn't do much for a long while, and really only got to changing very recently. Within the last 10 years. And now you can see that's, I think that's up to 17 and change at the moment.
But yeah, I mean, that's like banks and airlines, isn't it? I don't know. Maybe it's not quite as relevant with certain industries. I don't know.
Yeah, it was really interesting. So I'm thinking back to when Biden first became U.S. president. They were floating a $15 federal minimum wage, which had been a huge increase for them, right? Because it's still $7.25. That didn't go through, but at the same time, we as Canadians were floating kind of this $15 minimum wage here as well, as part of the federal budget back then. So I think that was the 2021. And so that eventually became us getting the $15 for federally regulated industries, and then they did it for government contracts after we did it. So in this case, they made the first move, it didn't go through, and then we made the real move, and then they followed.
Interesting.
Yeah. Yes.
Ultimately, I guess for Alberta or any other province, it should be a conversation about, what we think the wage ought to be, what goes into calculating that. I'm curious, to what extent does it matter what our neighbors are doing, right? So Alberta goes from having the highest now to the lowest, but I don't know. I mean, if other provinces hadn't caught up or if other provinces hadn't surpassed us, like, how relevant is it when we look at what's going on elsewhere?
I mean, I think a lot of the reason that it's in the media now is because Alberta's minimum wage just hasn't moved relative to the other provinces, but that's only because we moved first in a time where inflation was as low as it is now, right? In this kind of 2% range. And over 2022, 2023, when inflation really got cranked up to, let's say, 7%, I think, for each of those 2 years, that's what really enticed all these other provinces and territories to move, right? I hear what you're saying, though, and my research definitely reflects your premise, because I tend to think that wages and prices in a locality should go hand in hand. So I think that minimum wage policy should actually be closest to what the price levels and what the wage levels are in that jurisdiction or locality. So I do lots of local labor market analysis in my research. And so that's what we tend to use is that variation. Unfortunately, for Canada, these are all at the province level, all at the territory level. But then you can use kind of within province or within territory variation in, let's say, economic regions to kind of tease out, well, what's happening to the high price areas? What's happening to the low price areas? So I think you definitely have the right premise that we should just be setting it in terms of our wage levels, in our price levels. However, within Alberta, we have lots of differences in price levels and wage levels just across our 7 economic regions.
Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, I know the Alberta government will say, cost of living, you can look at elsewhere in the country. And sure, Toronto, Vancouver, those are expensive places. But even within Alberta, there's a huge difference between living in, say, Wainwright or Drumheller and living in Edmonton or Calgary. But I don't know. I mean, we're kind of stuck with this as a jurisdiction. It wouldn't be realistic to have local municipal minimum wages, would it?
So I don't think municipalities have the power to do that.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
However, and I've always teased this for any of our 13 provinces or territories, I don't think it prevents a province or territory from setting a different minimum wage for municipalities, at least temporarily, or maybe even permanently within their jurisdiction. I kind of had this as a piece of advice in the report of the minimum wage expert panel, because we followed the example of New York State at the time when they rolled out their path to a $15 minimum wage. They did so geographically, hitting the high price New York area first, then moving the next year out to the suburbs, and then moving the next year out to other cities within the state. And so I was thinking that's very much something we could try in Alberta, so long as they had the legal power to do that. And from what I heard with everyone who I spoke to that has a legal background, Alberta or any other province or territory can do that. But it brings in legislative complexity, right? So yeah. I understand that part.
Yeah, but I mean, it cuts to the question of, how do we determine what the minimum wage should be, right? We have the benefit of saying, well, what is it now? What was it before? You can look at the consumer price index, inflation, the calculations that go into the so-called living wage. But I don't know. I mean, is there a simple answer to the question? What should the minimum wage be?
Yeah, the living wage argument is tricky given the heterogeneity within Alberta, because then you would be setting it, I would assume, to the lowest living wage, not necessarily the highest living wage, because it is a minimum wage, right? That could be one possibility, though, of how we think about the minimum wage. That's definitely one possibility. Another possibility is, what have the growth in prices or earnings have been over the previous year? And if you remember back to 2015, that's the formula we had, right? Mm-hmm. So Alberta, Saskatchewan at the time had the same exact minimum wage formula that was half tied to price increases in the previous year and half tied to earnings increases in the previous year. And when we went on this journey from $10.20 to $15 over 2015 to 2018, Alberta scrapped that tie to these automatic movements. So that I thought that was a nice instrument. And the minimum wage expert panel also thought that too in our report, that once we became kind of middle of the pack, median or average, in terms of our minimum wage relative to the other provinces and territories, that could be brought back, because that is a nice way to set it going forward, right? So I don't know what the ultimate level is best to start with, but at least going forward, that makes sense, right? So that only partially answers your question in terms of growth, not necessarily the initial level.
Well, I think it speaks to the dilemma facing the government right now, because we did have a simple formula, and it would probably make sense to go back to it. But, it's kind of, did we need a period of adjustment, right? Did we go too far too fast? Did we need a few years to allow things to catch up? I mean, what do you make of the argument that that's kind of what Alberta needed to do the last few years?
So within the too far too fast argument, I and my co-author, Sebastian Passari, also here at the University of Alberta, we have the only academic study on Alberta's $15 minimum wage policy. Right. And we do find that the policy did work as intended, in that A lot of workers that were making 10.20 moved up to 11.20 in that first increase, moved up to 12.20 in the next increase, then 13.60, and then eventually $15. But along the way, workers lost their jobs. And so we estimate that it was about 25,000 jobs lost, mostly amongst the young, 15 to 24-year-olds, and mostly for those outside of our major cities of Edmonton and Calgary. Mm-hmm. So too far, too fast. It would have seemed that way at the time, especially with a 47% nominal increase in a time where inflation was like it is today, about 2%. I think in 2016, it was actually zero for one particular year, like it was in 2020 as well.
Yeah.
So a little bit of kind of too far, too fast in those lines. One kind of rule of thumb that I take from that study that's not necessarily highlighted in the study, but I always like to mention it when we're thinking about these things. So essentially what that policy did is for every 7 workers that got a raise, 1 worker lost their job. So you can take that number and say, oh, that's a terrible thing. We should have never done that. Or you might say, oh, 7 to 1. That's actually a pretty good ratio, right? So we make no judgment about that. We're just the ones that generate the numbers about what had happened.
But of course, there are those who are low wage earners who are not necessarily minimum wage earners, right? And so when we look at this in the context of, are we addressing poverty, does raising the minimum wage do anything for those who earn, say, just above it?
So this is something that Sebastian and I are continuing to work on today. It's not published yet, but I'll share a little bit of what we're seeing in the data when we look at this. So we're finding that those that get the largest wage increases from a minimum wage change, and this is across all of Canada, not just for Alberta now, are the ones that have the largest reduction in their work hours. Which may mean that earnings is left unchanged, right? So you get this kind of hourly wage increase, but if you then work less hours, it could be that your earnings are left completely unchanged.
Right.
The one thing our study cannot say anything about is who cut the hours. That's obviously a very interesting question. So we don't know if the employer cut the hours in response to the cost of the business, or if it's actually workers self-selecting and saying, oh, I got $1 increase in my wage, I'll just work less hours and have the same earnings. And it really gets into welfare trade-offs like you're looking for, right? Yeah. So maybe I have a small child and I put that child in daycare. Now I choose to work 2 less hours, keep my earnings the same, but take my child out of daycare. That actually means more money for me because I'm not paying the daycare for those 2 hours, and I get the quality time with my child. So there are major welfare implications that our initial study totally overlooked because we were trying to go after, were there employment changes from this policy or not? Now that we're widening our scope, we're finding lots of interesting other trade-offs like the one in hours and like the one in total welfare.
Well, it's interesting. And it also, I guess, speaks to the question of who are minimum wage earners, right? I mean, does it tend to be then those who work part-time, maybe they're secondary earners in their household, or it's a second job, or are we talking about young people, students, et cetera?
It's something we're trying to address in our research now. So it's definitely majority youth. It's definitely majority female, and playing into female workers, especially those with children versus without, is something that we're trying to address now to see where these kind of welfare gains or welfare losses are happening. But it's very much the case that majority are young and majority are female in any of the jurisdictions throughout Canada.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting now because, there's a whole debate happening around the temporary foreign workers program and why businesses are having trouble filling these very jobs that we're talking about. And here in Alberta, like other parts of the country, unemployment for young people is still stubbornly quite high. So what do we read into that? And I mean, the fact that Alberta has left its minimum wage unchanged doesn't seem like we're necessarily further along in providing those opportunities for young people.
So a lot of the media coverage addressing these minimum wage changes on October 1st next week are they're focusing on Alberta being an outlier in terms of being the lowest minimum wage as of October 1st at $15, and we're 35 cents below. But the other thing we're an outlier in is we have the highest unemployment rate amongst 15 to 24-year-olds at 17%. Given that minimum wage can have disemployment effects, this would not be a policy to try to address the unemployment situation. It is not a policy that would increase job growth. And actually, it might even entice more if you were to increase the minimum wage, it might even entice more young individuals to search for minimum wage jobs, which if you're searching, you could go from out of the labor force into that unemployment count and then increase the unemployment rate in that way, right? So it could even make the situation worse. I'm not sure what those margins look like. But in general, I would think that this isn't the policy to try to do that. But luckily, the Ministry of Jobs, Economy, Trade, and Immigration, they are bringing policies, I think just last week, in an attempt to attack this stubbornly high, as you described, unemployment rate amongst youth.
So does it or should it give the Alberta government pause as it contemplates next steps from a minimum wage, or how connected are these issues, do you think?
I mean, I think they are quite connected. Again, I can't tell you the exact margins of how this would work in current time in 2025. But I would say that the report of the minimum wage expert panel, the advice of it, still stands. If we were to switch back, so now 10 years not having the automatic increases in the minimum wage, and we were to switch back to that today, prices over this year have only grown by 2%. So this would not lead to a huge increase in the minimum wage come next year. But we could at least, think that we are covering the price growth in terms of our minimum wage from this year to next, and we might feel okay about that. And if there are disemployment effects with only a 2% increase, I don't think we would see much at all.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know that inflation's been worse in provinces that have raised minimum wage, but is minimum wage at all inflationary? And is that a concern if we're looking out for the interest of low-wage workers?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. So I heard these arguments back when we were contemplating how to address analyzing the $15 minimum wage policy here. And I don't feel that even with huge minimum wage changes at that time, 47% nominal increase. And then for liquor servers, it was actually a 63% increase because they had a differential that went away as part of that policy. I don't see minimum wage changes as drivers to general price changes. If you zeroed in more to maybe the fast food industry, perhaps there could be some sort of connection there. But even those, you have very large franchises, so local changes wouldn't make a big change in prices. I remember hearing back in 2016, there was a franchise owner from Little Caesars, I believe, that said, hey, no matter what's happening in this province, our prices are set nationally. There's nothing I can do about my prices, right? So that tells you right there that there's very little control over prices, at least with this one example.
So in terms of Alberta's next steps, I mean, you mentioned where maybe we're seeing some push or some building of a $20 campaign. It's hard to imagine Alberta would go through that all over again, but there is something about, the politics of it, the round numbers, and to an academic, it must seem weird, but nobody's out there, calling for 1825 or something. It does tend to be these nice round numbers, right?
I mean, it's these nice round numbers and slogans that got us our $15 minimum wage to begin with. Because in 2015, my first question, and probably yours as well, is where did that number come from? The $15, right? And as you've looked across jurisdictions, and not just within North America, but across the world, many jurisdictions ran with this $15 and in various currencies. So you're right. The power of kind of the slogan in the round number really pushed for this 15. I mean, it initially came from fast food workers in New York City, right? They were the one that came up with the slogan for Fight for 15, and that just spread globally through various unions. So perhaps my forecasted race to $20 won't get started until we hear some very catchy slogan that has 20 in it. I might be the harbinger of that right now in saying that, but it could very well be the case that all it takes is some kind of catchy slogan, and here we are, a race to 20.
And I think too, and I've seen other economists point this out, when we talk about the broader question of poverty and low-wage workers, especially those that don't earn minimum wage, we've got other tools. Alberta has its, the tax-free allowance. We've got the childcare benefit, other programs. In that context too, instead of being narrowly focused on minimum wage, does it make sense to look at how these other programs fit in?
Absolutely. I think it's just minimum wage gets so much attention that it feels like, okay, this is the kind of the sledgehammer that governments can use or not use to address these issues. I think by far it is not the best anti-poverty policy. So I think it wasn't necessarily intended to do that even initially. And in 2025, I don't think that that's necessarily the intention at all.
So is it your expectation, and I guess would it also be your advice to the Alberta government to settle back in then to that old formula, to have kind of a predictable, steady process moving forward on minimum wage?
Yes. And so we handed this report in. So as you pointed out, it was a 2019 panel. We had wrapped up in early 2020. We handed it in at the worst deadline ever, end of February 2020, right when COVID got ramped up. So it sat a while. It was published in 2023 by the ministry once COVID was over. But the 2020 advice was, hey, we should have either a panel like this or some group of expert individuals get together roughly every 5 years to see what the current situation is and whether the policy should be changed. We're right at that 5-year mark from the 2020 advice, right? Yeah. So I think 2025 is a good time to look at this. We are kind of in the meaty pack, so to speak, of this $15 to $16 range in the minimum wage that most provinces and territories are a part of. And so indexation, I think that's a real possibility. I think it would be good for the policy to go along with that advice, but maybe there are other pieces that we could introduce there that maybe the panel also thought of, but maybe we didn't now that it's 5 years later. Maybe there's kind of new ways to think about this that perhaps I haven't even thought about yet.
We'll see where this goes from here. I'm sure we've not heard the last of this debate, but Joseph Marchand, appreciate your insight, and thank you so much for joining us here.
Thanks, Rob. Great to see you again.
All right. Well, our thanks once again to Joseph Marchand, professor of economics at the University of Alberta, founding director of the Alberta Centre for Labour Market Research, and of course, he was chair of that 2019 expert panel on minimum wage in Alberta. So it's still an open question in terms of where things go from here. The Alberta government does seem a little bit frozen when it comes to next steps in minimum wage policy, but it does seem likely we'll probably end up reverting back to the previous policy where minimum wage increases are linked to changes in overall wages and inflation. There does, though, seem to be a new burgeoning campaign calling for a $20 an hour minimum wage, although it is worth noting that, at least for now, Alberta's NDP is not jumping on that bandwagon. So there doesn't seem to be a consensus on what the minimum wage should be, and there probably is no right answer for for what the minimum wage should be. But it does seem like this will be an ongoing debate here in the province of Alberta. That will do it for this episode of the Line Alberta podcast. Don't forget to follow us, subscribe at alberta.readtheline.ca. My name is Rob Breakenridge. Thanks so much for joining us here this week on the Line Alberta podcast.